Hello and welcome to this episode of the AML Clinic Podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Clement. Today, we're diving into one of the biggest and misunderstood risks facing law firms. Not financial risk, not cyber risk, but the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing the things they should. My guest today is Christian Hunt, author of Human Risk, host of the Human Risk Podcast, and one of the world's leading thinkers on behavioural science and how it can transform compliance. Christian helps organizations understand a simple but uncomfortable truth, which is that most compliance failures don't come from bad people, they come from people operating in badly designed systems. We're talking about why intelligent, well trained professionals sometimes break rules they fully understand, why traditional compliance approaches, policies, training modules, tick boxes often fail, and what behavioural science tells us about getting legal professionals genuinely on board with compliance. Christian brings a completely fresh angle to compliance. He challenges the idea that more rules and more training are the answer, and whether we are actually making it easy for people to do the right thing. Welcome to the AML Clinic, Christian.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. Pleasure to be here.
For anyone who might not be familiar with your work, could you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you ended up specializing in something as fascinating as human risk?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I always look back on it and think, how the hell did we get here? But I'll try and sort of retrofit what happened to me. And I say what happened to me in the sense of I chose certain careers that got me to where I am now. So let's explore that. But we probably should start with the fact that as a kid, I was very curious. Right? I would ask loads of questions. And my parents would indulge that. And one of the things that was fascinating for me was that they would indulge it even when it was kind of embarrassing for them. Because typically my questions revolved around people and why they were doing things. And so I took that with me. I did a literature degree at university, and literature is all about people. We tend not to write novels and plays about things. We write them about humans or proxies for humans. So I'd always had this kind of interest. And I'd alongside doing more serious things like qualifying as an accountant, which we won't talk about, and ending up in banking, I'd always maintained this interest in why do people do what they do? Partly to answer a question about why was I doing stuff that I did or wasn't doing things that I should be doing. But equally, I was just curious about the world around me. And I ended up totally by accident, post the 2008 financial crisis, working at the Financial Services Authority, so the single regulator at the time for financial services in the UK. And the reason for that was they were looking for people that weren't natural regulators. So I'd done a kind of classic sort of banking career with a few quirks on the way. And they were looking for people that weren't natural regulators to help shift the regulatory agenda post the sort of changes that they were bringing in. And so I joined the FSA in international banking supervision, which is the bit of the regulator that faces off against the outside world, as you'll know, and spent most of my time there dealing with one particular firm, which was UBS. And as your listeners who understand anything about regulation, all of them will understand if a regulator's looking at you, it's not because you're doing everything right. And so UBS had presented itself as a little bit of a gift to me. And within 7 days of me heading up this function supervising international banks, they had a rogue trader in London that almost took the firm down and various other issues. So I spent most of my regulatory career looking at them. Joined the Bank of England, became COO at what became the Prudential Regulation Authority, didn't want to be a central banker, and so wanted to move back into the industry. And the logical place for me to go was the firm I'd spent most of my time looking at, which was UBS. I knew them. I knew exactly what I was getting into, and I knew that they were trying to do the right thing. And so I ended up working in risk and compliance at UBS, effectively eating my own regulatory cooking in that I'd been the senior regulator in the UK that had imposed things on the firm, and then I was having to implement them. And the bit of the firm I was responsible for was asset management, which was probably the one bit of UBS that hadn't really had any major issues. And so when regulators and the firm itself had sort of put in place remediation plans and changes to the way risk and compliance were done to solve the problems of the past, they weren't really thinking about asset management. And so I ended up in this world where I was responsible for implementing things that I understood the logic of, but just weren't landing. And I worked out why that was. And that was because we were not thinking about the people at the end of all of this. We were thinking about the organizational requirement to be compliant and the organizational requirement to manage risk.
Right.
But actually, if you start to think about how do you get an organization to be compliant, You can talk to a website or a legal entity or a system, but ultimately you
Mm,
need the human beings within the organization to respond. It's the business of influencing human decision making. If you can get the humans to do the things you need them to do, not do the things that you don't, then by proxy, the organization becomes compliant.
absolutely.
And the second bit of my portfolio is operational risk. And I realized that was all about people. And once you reframe this stuff as we're trying to influence humans, you suddenly go, well, if that's the job, if that's the challenge here, and we can think about that in terms of writing policies, training people, designing controls. Once you recognize that's about humans, then suddenly you got to think, well, wouldn't it be a good idea to understand how those humans think? Not how we'd like them to think, but how they are actually likely to think. And then we can design things that make it more likely or get the outcomes we're looking for. Long-winded story to say I then set up a behavioral science function within the firm. And then 2019, just before the world went crazy, Michelle, I stepped out and I now work with a broad range of organizations, everybody from UN chemical weapons inspectors and the RAF through a load of regulated industries, including, of course, the legal industry, out
Yeah.
into tech companies. And what they all have in common is they employ human beings, and there's always some sort of regulatory or outside body that we have to keep happy. And so we're simultaneously trying to solve a problem, but we're
Mm.
also recognizing there are bodies out there who might think slightly differently to the way we do. So how do we also keep them happy?
Thank you, Christian. I mean, that's really helpful context. And I think it leads straight into the core of your work, which is this idea of human risk. And as we said, the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing the things they should. So, from your perspective, why do intelligent, well-trained professionals still fall into the knowing doing gap?
Well, because I think if you think about the rest of the way that we operate in the world, we all do things that we know we shouldn't. I hesitate to say that we all break the law once a day, but we will probably at least once a week, we will have broken. Now, hopefully, it's not a serious law, right? It's silly little, maybe a traffic violation or
Mm,
something, some small minor thing. And we all do things that are not good for us from a health perspective, from a
mm,
well-being perspective, because sometimes whisper it's fun or it's easier or whatever.
mm,
So this idea that we would behave in a sensible, rational way, economists love it, because they can create models for it. Regulators, legislators love it. But actually, that's not the way that we operate. And so this isn't a
mm,
work problem. This is a dynamic by the way we all navigate the world is we make judgment calls. Now, sometimes those judgment calls are influenced by we're influenced by other people. We see a load of other people doing something, we kind of join in.
mm,
We see that in riots, for example, where people who are otherwise well behaved do things they wouldn't do if they weren't in that particular crowd. Or we just behave in strange, inexplicable ways. And I say
mm,
strange and inexplicable. There is always a reason why we do things. It might not be a good reason, but there will always be some sort of reason that we've done it. We've done it before and got away with it. We see other
mm,
people doing it. It's the easiest path. We're not really focused on the task in hand. We've got a million other ways doing it. This feels like a sensible thing to do. And
mm,
so when we look at the problem in the way you framed it, it's a presumption that there's a logical way people ought to do things and they're not complying with that logic. And I would say the logic is what's flawed here. That's the problem, is that we have these
right.
expectations for people. And of course, on
Mhm,
some level, when we think about the law, we do need people to behave in a particular way and do things that steer them off the natural path. But this is a
yeah.
basic human way that we navigate the planet. It's what makes life whisper it. Sometimes it makes life a bit more fun. Sometimes it makes life easier. Sometimes it's
Mm,
just the way we've always done things. And so I come back to the challenge of sort of saying we shouldn't expect people to behave in that way because that's
right.
not how we behave in other contexts. And inconvenient as it is, if we recognize that, we can then suddenly start to say, okay, where is it our expectations for what we'd like people to do or not do differ from the realities of what is making them do something else? And therefore, it's got nothing to do with intelligence necessarily. It's
Right.
just to do with environment, what we see other people doing, what we've done before, all those kinds of things.
Sure. That's fascinating. So, with that in mind, many organizations, including law firms, invest very heavily in policies, in training, but yet they still see non-compliance. And behaviorally, how does that approach break down? Is it the issue of clarity, usefulness, or is it a gap between the organization's intent and employees' reality? What's happening there?
Well, it's because we tend to approach the solution to these problems in ways that are logical, justifiable, rational, what we see other firms doing.
Mm,
And of course, if we've got a regulator to keep happy, we will do what the regulator expects us to do. But the regulator isn't necessarily thinking behaviorally. And if you want the sort of the best comparative, if you think about advertisements, which might sound weird to some of your listeners, but advertisements are an attempt to influence people typically to buy a service or product.
Yes.
And compliance is about influencing humans to follow a particular course of action or not follow a particular course of action. So it's the same quest, just in a different context. Now, if you look at what works in advertising, often it is the most ridiculous things. If we think about price comparison websites as one extremity, right, we have meerkats and we have opera singers and we have all sorts of weird things that are brought in to persuade us to use their services. Now, by any logical, rational way, why are these little things that aren't even animals persuading us to use a particular service? And the answer is because it's made us laugh, it's made it memorable. So if you look at things that work in advertising, that's often not logical. Doesn't make it. There is logic who's brought in, but look at how they sell cars. It'll be sold on. There'll be some emotional sell. Of course, they will use a whole load of technical blurb to try and sell things. But ultimately, if we think about certain car brands, it's this car is sexy, this car is safe, this car is fast, this car is environmentally, whatever it is, right? And we use those different things. And so if you look in that context, the reason they spend tons of money on advertising is because it works, right? You wouldn't waste a whole load of money on it. And so what that tells us is that to connect with human beings, we need to connect on a human level. Now, that might be an emotional level. Sometimes logic will play a part in that, but there are lots of factors that are there. And so when we look at what we're trying to do in compliance, we just make the presumption that because this is important, that people will agree with us, that people will want to do it. And that's not always true. And there's something I call the employment contract fallacy, which lawyers often hate because they go, what do you mean the employment contract? If you've signed an employment contract, right, that you are bound by the employment contract. Correct. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't use this. There are going to be times where as employers, we want to tell our employees what to do, and there's no questions asked, do this. But there are going to be times where we need them to do things to a certain standard, the qualitative component, or where we can't observe what they're doing. We might discover it afterwards, but we won't be there in the moment. Or we need them to use their judgment. What's appropriate in one situation might not be in another. And so when we think about those situations, if we're just spending the whole time having a relationship with them that is basically, we employ you so we can tell you what to do, that can be effective, but it'll run out of road where we need people's buy-in, where we can't see what they're doing, where we may be irritating them for other reasons, And so when we none of us likes being told what to do. So when we think about all of those things, is we're using levers that I'm not saying are inappropriate, but I think if we use them all the time, we're missing a trick. And the trick that we're missing here is that we employ people, particularly in the 21st century, we employ people for their human intelligence. And so we shouldn't be surprised when they use the same judgment that we're expecting them to use in their day-to-day work on, do I think this rule makes sense? And it might not be a conscious judgment, but on some subconscious thing, it'll be, well, that's a bit silly, or I don't, or I can see why this rule's here, I'm happy to comply with it, or this is a pain in the backside, I'm not. And so what I'm saying in my approach is not that we shouldn't have the right as employers to tell people what to do, not that we shouldn't use that. But we should recognize that if that is all we are doing, that runs out of road because we don't follow instructions from everybody all of the time in other parts of our lives. And so really it's about recognizing how can we best connect with humans and make sure that we get the balance between kind of nudging or cajoling them and reminding of them right versus the times where we just say, this is what you must do, no questions asked. And so the more intelligent the people that we have, the more we ask them to use judgment in their roles, the more we should expect them to also be doing the same thing when it comes to the rules that we expect them to follow.
It's a really important point. I think you kind of set into the psychology of lawyers slightly. Lawyers are trained to challenge, interpret, find ambiguity, which is brilliant for legal reasoning, but probably less so for when you want people to do something. Lawyers often point out that SRA fines are usually for technical breaches rather than actual money laundering. Behaviorally, how can that mindset unintentionally shape compliance behavior, do you think?
Well, so let's firstly look at fines as a sort of backdrop. And typically the answer is, well, this is going to cost the firm a load of money. And so if you happen to be an equity partner in a firm, that might, you're going to go, I don't want the firm to be spending money. If you're a relatively junior employee, it might not hit you in the same way. You might not be thinking that, particularly in an environment where maybe you're not planning to be there for life. A lot of these constructs that we have and the ways that we communicate with people is on a presumption that their interests are aligned with the interests of the firm. And on some level, of course, that'll be true, right? Because if the firm doesn't exist, or has to make cuts or whatever, then you no longer have employment. So at least in the
Yeah.
short term, you are incentivized. But if you look in the longer term, and we know this because firms dangle partnerships in front of people and sort of get them to stick around, and that is, it works brilliantly for people to get it. But even then, partners move between firms. So
Yeah.
the idea that we have that with the sort of there is this lock-in that aligns our interest with the firm's interest, I think is flawed. And so the language of fines often speaks to the firm and not necessarily to the individual. So I'd say there's a backdrop that's a challenge there. And then the second thing you point towards is that question of, well, okay, we've been fighting. The regulator seems a bit pernickety. They seem to be more stuck on process than they do on outcomes. That seems a bit silly. I don't buy into that. So it's not desperately persuasive because you sort of go, well, that doesn't, and particularly where, as you say, if your job involves being intelligent and using your judgment and thinking about things, then you're going to be thinking about the construct that's placed in front of you.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that fines do have an impact on some level, but we need to also start to recognize that question. And the fundamental question that drives most people is kind of what's in it for me.
Yes.
When we make decisions, we're looking, and it may not be consciously there, but we're kind of thinking, well, how do I get what works for me in this situation? And I'm not suggesting it's always selfish. Sometimes it can be, in a family context, it might be what's best for the family unit or best for whatever. But all of those dynamics come into play. And so when I look at, I understand why regulators use fines, because particularly where the law only permits them to fine firms, but we're seeing in financial services, we've got accountability regimes that are pinning it on individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that starts to make it a bit more interesting. So I think you've got a combination of factors that really play into the narrative, I think, that is often used both by regulators and within firms. And we should bear in mind that when a regulator uses a narrative to firm, it's very tempting for the firm to use the same narrative internally. Very safe.
Yeah.
Right? I'll just repeat what the regulator said.
Yeah.
And that can be effective. But that can also get lost in translations. People go, I don't know, what is that? This means nothing to me, or it doesn't. Right? So bringing all these factors together means it's there isn't a straightforward answer to your question because it's complicated.
Yeah.
But I think but what people often say to me is, well, this you're just making it harder, right? We had a simple world where we just told them what to. The problem is that simplistic model of the world doesn't always work. And so what I'm saying is we need to go into the complexity and think a little bit more. Now, you can ignore me and say, I don't like complexity because you're telling me it's complicated and challenging and people do things for different reasons and blah, blah, blah. I don't have time for any of that stuff. But that doesn't make the problem go away. The problem is still there. So what I'm suggesting is we act a little bit more intelligently and use an understanding of humans. And so the example that you've given is I don't think it lands in the way it's intended to land. And we know from advertising that if an ad campaign doesn't land in the way it's intended to land, you won't sell the product or service that you're expecting to sell in the volumes that you expect to sell. In fact, it can be detrimental to you. We've seen ad campaigns go wrong. So, long-winded way of saying this is highly complicated and there are lots of factors at play that aren't always considered.
Yeah, very interesting. And also, I just wanted to draw out something that you said in your book, which is the risk of a fine becoming a fee. And you gave an example of the parking.
I used to work for a family office, and we see, there's science, there's the scientific research that demonstrates this occurs in other contexts, but I like to talk about things that have happened to me to bring these things alive. And so the sort of head of that family office would regularly park his vehicle in a place where you almost a racing certainty you were going to get a fine at some point. And I was like, why you shouldn't park there? And he pointed out that the cost of the fine, and he wasn't getting fined every day, it was every so often, was worth paying because it was cheap parking. And so this idea the fine is supposed to tell you, and he can send someone to go collect the car, right? It's just convenience. Yeah. So he's buying convenience. And so actually, that's just a great example of fines. It's just the cost of doing business. And so if the fine is miscalibrated, actually, rather than disincentivizing, you can actually incentivize people to do the very thing you don't want them to do.
Yes. I think there's a danger of that with law firms as well. So typically SRA fines they fall between anything between 0.5% to 2%. So, if you're a massive firm turning over millions and the amount you're going to be fined versus the amount you're going to make on a transaction, there's a real danger there.
And it's even worse than that in a way, actually, because there's research out there that talks about the fact that being fined actually can be an advertisement for people to come and work with you, because you say, if you think about, for example, I want to IPO my company, or I want somebody that's going to really act on my behalf. You kind of want people that are pushing the limits a little bit. And so certainly in a banking context, fines for misconduct are actually seen as these people really understand the markets. They're prepared to go the extra mile, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
So not only is it's not just a sort of neutral thing that the firm pays, it can have the opposite effect in terms of marketing. Now, I'm not suggesting a firm would go out and say, we've been fined more than anyone else, but there is an element of what are the subliminal messages that are here. So again, we often think about formal communications as we're telling them this. We often communicate things we don't mean to. So a good example in a compliance context is if you send a signal out and regulate, this applies as much to regulators as it does within firms. If you send a signal out saying lots of people have failed to comply with the rules, and you might do that by just overly communicating and saying, it is important that you remember to do the following. Message from the senior partner is blah, 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 blah. Well, in our minds, we go, okay, I hear the message, but I'm also thinking, why are they communicating that? Clearly, there are lots of people not doing this. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to do it. Yeah. And so we can inadvertently transmit signals. And so some of this is really quite subtle, but we need to think about not just the official message, but also what are people reading between the lines?
Sure, the Streisand effect. So I want to move away from individual psychology to look at compliance design itself. And what came strongly to me in the book was the idea that traditional toolkit is often not fit for purpose. So you describe how organizations rely on information dumps, long policies, predictable training, tick boxing. Anyone in the legal sector understands everything that I've just said there. So you describe the moment a new joiner sits in an induction training, they're worried about different things. The organization's just trying to dump the policy and just tick a box to say we've done it. But can we just talk about the mismatch there? What are organizations hoping to achieve through induction, and what's the employee really taken away from that? And how do we apply that in the wider context of compliance?
Sure. So whenever I tell these stories, I exaggerate slightly for effect, right? And just to make the point. But if we think about induction training, right? So it's your first day in a new employer, and you're turning up and you are thinking a whole load of things like, how long is it going to take me to get there? Have I made a bad decision? I'm handing over my identity to you and you're taking it away. When am I going to get my passport? Where are the toilets? Kind of like first day at school thinking, right? And it does feel a little bit like first day at school. So you're turning up with these thoughts, primarily as sort of like, what is this place going to be like? I'm trying to suss this place out. Yeah. From an organizational perspective, it's kind of like, we better make sure that we can say that we've told them all these things.
Yeah.
And so the mismatch there is what you're telling them is what's organizationally convenient. And the overlap between what the person wants to hear and what you're telling them can be fairly limited. Now, there will be things that overlap that are useful for both sides. We all understand if we're showing up in a new building, to be told where the fire escapes are or whatever, right, is useful, practical information that we might need. But being told what the risk framework is about, or even messages like, we are an ethical organization. So you watch these videos, typically it's a video of the CEO or the senior partner or whatever, saying something like, we are a meritocratic ethical organization. And they ram this point home. And you kind of think, why are they doing that? Right? Why do I need to? Maybe it's not ethical at all. And so the curious childlike eyes that we use when we join a new organization often are at odds with the brain that we're just going to dump this stuff so that we can tell you. And the problem is, if you're hiring smart people, they come in and they know when you're just dumping crap on them. Mm-hmm. And we've seen this in lots of other situations where, read these terms and conditions before you rent the car, right? And so we know that whenever there's a situation where people aren't speaking to us, they're just sort of reading out a script or chucking stuff at us, we tend to switch off. And I think that is unhelpful for two reasons. One is it means whatever is in the script isn't connecting. But the second thing is we're sending a signal about the sort of organization that we are. So we're saying to people, we're the sort of organization where we prioritize, rather than prioritizing you as an employee, we prioritize covering our backsides. And so there's that mismatch between those two. Now, again, I'm talking in extremities. Of course, that everybody accepts to a certain amount of, there's going to be stuff we have to go through to do it. And we probably accept if we're a lawyer working in the legal sector that, we understand. So there may be a bit more tolerance for it towards the thing you're talking about. But, it's literally, my view is, of course, there will be a certain amount of things that you have to dump on people and do that. But try and minimize that and try and recognize the realities of what people are thinking. And it's particularly bad where if it's propagandist, in other words, you turn up to this thing and you're told that this is how the organization runs. And then what happens is you go out and you see the reality of it. And for example, if you've been told in this induction training that this is a very ethical organization and you realize pretty quickly it's not, right? Because you observe real behavior, and we will prioritize observed real behavior over theoretical, what we're told this world is like any day.
Mm,
That's why eyewitness accounts, that's why travel reviews matter more than advertisements, right? Because we want to see, what is
mm,
it really like? And so if you see that there's a disconnect, you start to think, well, the organization's a bit deluded, right? They say one thing and they mean another. And so we can
mm,
send a signal that actually this organization is all about box ticking and delusion, and we
mm,
pretend to be ethical, blah, 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 when in
mhm.
reality, I can see that we're not. And so
Yeah.
that's where these tensions arise. And again, I stress, I exaggerate slightly to make a point, but if you want induction training to be effective, don't just think about what you need to dump on them. Think about what it is they are likely to want to hear.
Let's move on to something that I think every law firm or any organization probably struggles with, and that's training. So, your book highlights that many organizations design training to be easy to roll out, to monitor, and to show compliance to regulators. But behaviorally, why does that approach fail to actually ensure that the employee understands or remembers what they've been taught? What should training focus on instead?
So the starting presumption behind training is this is important. We need them to know this, and therefore we will present it to them, and they will pay attention. Right. And just because somebody is showing up to training doesn't mean that they are learning it. We have all been on training or things masquerading as training where we've paid no attention whatsoever. Go back to
Yeah.
school, right, with classes that we sort of daydream through. And so turning up to training, whether you log on or attend in person, is necessary but not sufficient. You can't learn from something you haven't shown up to.
Mm,
But just because you're there doesn't mean you are learning anything. And
true.
so the presumption is always, well, if I've got them here, then they're paying attention. And that's just
Mm,
not correct at all. We need to get to that second level of saying, if the purpose of training is just to say you've done it and you don't actually care, right? You just want to say to a regulator, we think this is a stupid regulation. You never say this, but we think it's a stupid regulation. Let's just take the box, right? Then all what I'm about to say doesn't apply at all. Right? Then do just go through the motions, right? Because people will be able to sense when you're going through the motion. But if we
mm,
really want people to pay attention, we got to think about what information do they need, not to become mini compliance experts themselves. And I
yeah.
jokingly say the average employee is not interested in compliance. I don't mean they're interested in being non-compliant. I mean they're not interested in the detail of, because if they
Yeah.
were, they'd be working in compliance. They're
Yeah.
interested in sales or law or whatever their job happens to be.
Mhm.
So we need to connect with them on a level that recognizes they might not be naturally passionate about this subject. And what we're trying to equip them with is a skill set to do their job more compliantly, not
Mm,
to be technical experts in the subject. And yet the way training is often framed is, I'm going to teach you about the genesis of the regulation. I'm going to teach you about the minutiae of it. And therefore, I'm going to put you in the best possible position to comply with it. Well, that's not true, because that's the theory of it. That's not the realities of
yeah.
of what does that mean for them. So if we want them to genuinely pay attention, we need to translate the theory of what it says into practical realities. What do they need
Mm,
to do when? And potentially we need to explain why. Sometimes we don't need to explain the why at all, either because it's obvious or it's not relevant, but sometimes it's
yeah.
incredibly relevant. You need to give them that backdrop. And so we need to be thinking about what sort of practical skills do I want them to come out with, so that they will behave differently from the way that they probably came into the training course. And that comes through in both the way we teach, but also we often like to have little exams at the end,
Mm,
sort of multiple choice. And the theory is to make sure you were paying attention and we can pass or fail you. And what we test in that is often pointless things. So we will, failure to comply with this regulation will see you go to jail for 5, 10, 15, or 20 years.
yeah.
Now, the detail of that question is utterly irrelevant, because you don't
Mhm.
want someone going, oh, well, that's a 5-year rule, whereas this is a 20. I'll break the 5-year one because then I have less time in jail. You don't want anyone thinking in those terms. And the problem with it is people know that that's why you're doing it. They know you're testing things that are easy to test.
Yeah.
If you want them to take practical skills away, test, and you have to test. Maybe we don't have to test those practical things. And often tests are pointless, because what we're doing is we're telling you something and then we're testing your short-term memory to see, can you retain these things?
Exactly.
That doesn't have any bearing on, is it changing the way you operate in day-to-day existence? Have you understood this properly? Have you thought about it? Do you recognize where this is relevant to you? All that kind of stuff. And the
Yeah.
risk with all of this is not just the time wasted in the thing, but it's the signal it sends. It's if you are making people do all this stuff that's just performative basis to cover the firm's backside, smart people will clock that. And they're going to
Yes.
go, well, they're only doing it to cover their backside. I'm not really going to pay. I'm just going to get through this nonsense and move on and go back to doing what I was doing before. And that's why a lot of these things fail, is we're thinking about sort of a theoretical dump because that feels justifiable. I'm saying if you really want people to learn, then think about other contexts in which first aid, for example, we don't test people. If we want to say if people paid attention to first aid training, we give them practicals to do. What do you do in this situation?
Absolutely.
We don't teach them about, have you learned complicated words for parts of the body? You don't need that to do first aid.
Resonates on so many levels. I'd like us to talk about distinguishing between a person or people problem and a rule problem. So before we start, could you just explain the difference between a person problem and a rule problem, please?
Yes. So I use a traffic analogy to make this point and say that when we think, and this is a good example of pick a different context. I'm not saying it's 100% relevant, but it's helpful as a sort of parable stroke analogy to get messages across. So when we think about traffic situations, we have two bits of logic. One is speed camera logic that says if we want to deter and catch drivers that are speeding. And we use that very frequently in kind of compliance. And we sort of say, if we can catch these bad people breaking the rules, then we solve the problem. And there will be situations in which that makes sense. But there's a second bit of traffic logic that we often don't use, which is what I might call the accident hotspot logic, which is here's a junction where there are or a stretch of road where there's lots of people speeding or there's lots of accidents. There's something not quite working. And we look at it and say, hold on a minute, it's unlikely that all of these people have deliberately set out to break the rules here or to cause accidents. So we hold them accountable for sure, but we also know what is it in the environment that's causing that to happen? Because we could ban all of those people from driving and still have the same problem with a whole load of new drivers if we don't change the environment. Translate that into rules, and I say very, very simply, if one or two people are breaking a rule, then you've probably got a rule problem. In other words, if most people can be compliant, and one or two people can't, that points towards, doesn't necessarily guarantee it because there may be specific circumstances that explain this, but generally points towards them being the problem. If everybody else manages to do it and they can't, that points towards them probably being the problem. But if lots of people are not complying with the rule, you've definitely got a rule problem, by which I mean it's unlikely that you're going to have loads of people coming into your organization setting out to break a rule. So if lots of them are doing it, that tells you that there is something in the rule. And it may not be the rule itself. It may be the training, the way it's communicated. You taught them about this 8 years ago. It's not clear that it applies in this situation. It's a pain in the neck, whatever it is. Right? There's something in that is causing that problem. If you don't fix that and you just discipline those people, you can fire them all, get new people in, and you'll have the same problem. And the reason organizations love focusing on the people, it's a much better narrative, right? Because you can say, whether it's a rogue trader or whether it's somebody that's failed to comply with whatever, or just people that are just non-compliant, you can sort of go, they were bad apples, or we got rid of those awful people, the firm is fine.
Yeah.
It's a really convenient narrative, right? Which is why lots of firms cleave. And sometimes it's true, right? There will be. I'm not saying that's not true, but generally speaking, it's a really easy narrative to get to, and it works well with regulators. At least we think it works well with regulators. The opposite side is to go, well, actually, maybe we're part of the problem, right? Maybe we've designed rules, incentives, whatever, that are driving this particular behavior, and we have to face up to that. And so it's challenging and difficult, but I maintain that if you want to get this right, and you don't want to keep repeat performances of the same problems, then you need to have the ability to look at certain things and say it's a rule problem. So I think I would treat it as a sort of behavioral indicator and say, look, if lots of people aren't behaving in a particular way, let's have a look at why. And it won't entirely be their fault. There will be something that we are doing or not doing that has exacerbated the problem. If we can fix that, we can start to solve the problem.
So then I want to bring in an example from my time as a regulator. So just this summer, I led the SRO's thematic review on source of funds and source of wealth. And the same patterns of inadequate checks came up over and over again. So talking about 3 years worth of data where the SRO deems that these firms were not checking source of funds adequately. Unsurprisingly, the review highlighted that the requirement in the legislation is inherently ambiguous. It uses the phrase where necessary. So essentially, as a law firm or a fee earner, you are supposed to do source of funds check where you deem it necessary. So there are about 6,000 firms, just for context, who are supervised for AML purposes. So you can imagine the type of confusion this causes. So long story short, I ended up writing guidance to set, clear boundaries for law firms on what the SRA is considered to be adequate checks, and also the SRA's definition of what where necessary means, which was published last month, November 25. Actually, I'm aware that there's some firms who see the guidance as being quite heavy-handed. When in reality, this is with my regulator lens on, I think the root cause is the actual regulation itself. That's the rule problem. And I appreciate for a law firm that doesn't help you if you think that's quite heavy-handed with the SRA. But thank you very much. Really helpful example. If we move on to behaviors in high pressure environments. So law firms can be a high pressure environment. Partners and fee owners want to comply, but they also want the speed, the revenue, and client delivery. Um, what behavioral techniques could help reconcile those competing priorities without just adding more pressure?
So I think the first thing is to recognize that this happens. And I think often
Mm,
we don't. We kid ourselves that it's all going to be fine. Right? And I
mm,
think, this is where I look at regulators and auditors, anybody that's reviewing someone else's decision making. And I kind of get, and courts is another good example where we sort of step back and we slowly go through a particular situation and we go, well, this is what they should be doing, without recognizing that we all do stupid things when we're under pressure. And that pressure might come from tiredness. It might come from, just lots on our plate. It might just be we haven't had lunch, right? Or we've got,
yeah,
so there's all sorts of reasons that can come into play. And so we've got to recognize that when we employ humans, it comes with a tremendous amount of benefits, but also some disbenefits. And those disbenefits are that unlike machines, right, we
yeah.
can go off the rails a little bit. Somebody who's very sensible 99% of the time can be unsensible 1% of the time. Maybe that's just a facet of being human. So I think the first thing is recognizing it's there, and we all know it's there. Plenty of context, and we've all done stupid things.
Mm,
So when we look at that, we have to say, firstly, recognize that. And secondly, start to say, let's be empathetic to people. So rather than this blow by blow, what were you thinking at the time, legal logic that we see happening, got to
mm,
recognize that the reality of how humans are going to be making decisions. And so
mm,
I think we can identify patterns in that. And we can say, look, from past, particularly where we've got data around actually what humans have done, we can start to look at it and go, actually, this is unclear. And if we want people to make critical decisions in times when they're tired or when they might, where the common sense answer might not be obvious,
mm,
so it might not be the right thing to do, then we need to find ways of warning them that. And I think the best way of thinking about this is the physical world, where typically in industries where getting something wrong is a matter of life and death, they tend to find the ways of communicating to be, they're very clear on that, and they prioritize things that really matter and deprioritize things that matter less, and sort of triage that thing. And so I think looking at the realities of what are people going through at this particular moment, and therefore what pressures are there likely to be on them, we can start to see, well, where is it we need to guide them? And often we guide them on stuff that's blindingly obvious.
mm,
I'm reminded of the McDonald's, the sort of or coffee cups in general, right? The caution, the contents may contain hot liquids. Now, that's a legal argument that allows you, but that's not desperately helpful. That's wasting brain capacity. If you do that in another context, where
mm,
generally speaking, 99.9% of people know that if there's hot coffee, the coffee cup's going to have hot coffee in it, right? That we should be
mm,
careful with that. Kids might not. But
mm,
most adults probably do. So if we were looking at that as cognitive load, let's minimize the cognitive load statements, the obvious, and let's try
right.
and prioritize the things that are less obvious. And maybe we have to give people less steps to do in the moment. Are there things that we can front load, give them some at a time that's different?
Sure.
Whisper it, but sometimes we ask them to do stuff that serves no purpose whatsoever just because we can. And
Yeah.
often when things have gone wrong, we double down on the stuff that may have been contributing to it in the first place. So training is a good example, right? Something's
Mhm.
gone wrong, let's give them more training. Well, if the
Yeah.
training was part of the problem, giving them more of it's not a good idea. And I think often we layer on, I've inherited, when I was a compliance officer, I inherited 6 eyes checks. Well, why? Well, because they had 2 eyes, that didn't work, so they gave 4 eyes, so they made 6, without recognizing that actually 6 eyes was making it worse, because you would kind of go, well, somebody else will spot this, I don't need to bother. And everybody was thinking
Mm,
like that. So
yeah.
often we don't think about the realities of people in those particular situations, or we come at it
Mm,
with a cool, clear head as experts in the rule, and we design things for experts in the rule. And so I think lots of processes that people are required to go through, there's a presumption, annual processes. You say, well, they
mhm,
did this last year. Now, you've been working on that attestation or whatever process it is a whole year, so you're steeped in this stuff. It's really
yeah.
hard for you to reckon. Just because they did it a year, maybe even if they did it 2 months ago, they might have
Mm,
forgotten because there are higher priority things on their agenda. So design the
mhm,
process as if they've never done it before, rather than designing it in a way that presumes they have. Recognize where, and if common sense will get you to the right answer, maybe we would pull away from that and we focus on the things where common sense doesn't give you an answer. And so
mm,
sometimes that's counterintuitive, right? You would think that from a behavioral perspective, things that are the biggest risk are not necessarily from a risk perspective. because you think, well, the highest risk, maybe some of the highest risk stuff is very low risk from a behavioral perspective, and therefore we recalibrate those things. So it's about looking at the individual thing and saying, what is it like for the person going through this? But we have to think realistically about what that means. In other words, if we come at it as experts in an artificial environment, that's not going to tell us what real people in the real world undergoing real pressure are going to be going through.
Very helpful. So finally, just looking ahead, as the FCA prepares to take over AML supervision for the legal sector and other sectors, what behavioural shifts do you think law firms could expect? Do you think perhaps greater scrutiny, obviously with your background, more personal accountability? You've mentioned that earlier, a different cultural baseline?
I think it's a really interesting challenge because on the one hand, you'd say, well, the FCA know this subject really well because they're already dealing with it. And that's true. Right? On the other hand, you'd be saying, well, hold on a minute. This is a whole new different context, different cultures, different priorities, different challenges. So what I'm hoping, and there is no guarantee this will happen, but what I'm hoping is that they will take a long, hard look at it and say, where does our regime make sense in this new world and where does it not make sense? I fear that it may well be just, we're going to take what we already do and we're going to dump it on these people and they will comply with us. And if that happens, I'm going to start bleating very, very loudly and saying this is silly because all the dynamics you have talked about are very different in the legal sector. Now, I think the reason the regulation has been transferred means they're going to have to do some things differently. Just from a regulatory perspective, you can't just roll it. New sheriff in town, effectively. You can't just have a rollover of the existing regime. There are going to be some changes. And my message to law firms, and I know this is happening, is to really start influencing this heavily, right? Point out where these things don't make any sense and recognize that even when they come in with a new set of rules, there's going to be an opportunity to go, look, we're happy to go along with this, but this really doesn't work for us, and be ready to push back. Because I think there's often this thing about regulators not being willing to listen. The more it gets, behavioral thing, the more it gets embedded, the harder it is to argue. So I would be thinking about monitoring it very closely, recognizing you can't win every single battle. So I think it's going to be really interesting. Could go a multitude of different ways. The worst case scenario is they will apply exactly what they're applying now. I think that would be a mistake because it doesn't recognize the difference. On the other hand, I don't think law firms should expect it to be business as usual either, because that would be a mistake as well, I suspect. Right. So there's going to be this interesting thing. And that's why I think it's really important to have a voice and speak up. There are lots of sort of trade bodies that are talking about this stuff, is make sure you're plugged into those and understand those. And so I hope that there is a very human approach to this. I fear there might not be. But I think I think there is a path through this that is relatively easy. There is a path through this is relatively difficult. I hope we get closer to the former than the latter, because that's what we all want.
Yeah, you, I, and the other 6,000 firms that are supervised, Christian. But thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights into human risks and the way firms can practically influence behaviour rather than just relying on the rules and training. And I hope our listeners had lots to take away from this discussion. Christian, before I let you go, can you just tell our audience where they can find your book and follow your work?
Sure. So best place to find me is LinkedIn, where I hang out and do lots of videos and other fun things, as well as some more serious stuff. Failing that, human-risk.com. And then there's also humanriskpodcast.com, available on all of the major podcasting platforms.
Fantastic. And if you found this episode useful, consider subscribing and sharing it with your colleagues who live in the world of nuance, risk, and razor-thin judgment calls. And if you've got a topic you would like me to cover, I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening to the AML Clinic. Until next time, stay informed and stay compliant. Thanks, Mr.